today I'll be reading a lot of excerpts. But hopefully, at any point, if you have a question, a comment, please just feel free to raise your hand, say something, ask a question. We can talk about it and move on. I find that to be the best way to learn. First, we can interact as much as possible, even though I will be kind of reading a lot of just material. But hopefully some of those excerpts will inspire you to have some new ideas and questions. So please do ask questions. It's a pleasure to be here. And I want to thank Michelle, who's done an incredibly large amount of work to make this whole class come together. This is the second time he's putting this together, and it's a lot of work to grab people, put them together, create the flow of the courses, so I really have to commend him for doing that and publicizing it to a larger community. I can see we have some folks that are not our IIT students here, which is also very good. We encourage you to tell other people about the course and about all the various initiatives that we've been doing at IIT, and invite you all to be present. So thanks for being here. Okay, so yesterday's lecture addressed ideas of history. Whether or not India has history, of course it has history. But does it have history in the sense that the Western kind of intellectual tradition has understood and defined history? So did we come up with an answer to that? Yes, kind of, a little bit differently. Maybe it grew, like that kind of historical consciousness grew. Maybe it was not as present in the ancient past. Maybe it became more present as we moved closer towards the medieval, pre-modern period. But I think the most interesting thing is to really think about the fact that when we ask such questions, or when we deal with the meeting of cultures, which of course has been happening in India for millennia, it's like a matter of translation. You have a word like history, you have an idea like history, you have a concept like history that is known to a Western mind. How do you make that clear to another culture which may not have recourse to anything of that kind? Do we then just say that, no, there's no history in India because there's no word for history, there's no concept that deals with it? Well, in some sense, yes, you could say there is no sense of that kind of empirical, historical consciousness clearly evidenced in ancient India. Writing down the exact date when something happened, taking very, precise records of X, Y, and Z that happened during the governance of a kingdom. But obviously, Indians have history. Obviously, things happened in India in the past. And we really have to understand that it's all about different concepts of time. How you deal with your perception of time, your perception, your idea of what memory is. All of these are the kinds of questions we really want to investigate to find out how differently India looked at the world and herself. And one of the productive places where this kind of discussion happens is when you do have that opportunity where different cultures meet, right? So this guy says we have this kind of way of looking at things, this guy says we have this. You have a discussion, you understand the subtle differences or gross differences, you understand certain commonalities that you have, and then you can have a discussion. So today, we're going to explore actually quite a small little part of the Portuguese encounter in India, because they were some of the first people from the West, at least in that period, in the medieval type period, that came to Indian shores. And they stayed for quite a bit of time. I mean, does anyone know when Goa got its independence? Yeah, it was in the 60s, so not very long ago. So the Portuguese have been here for quite a bit of time, and actually we have a whole delegation of Portuguese visiting the Institute right now to sign some memoranda, hopefully, to increase collaboration between our two countries in the academic area. So that's good. Of course, I was joking with them as I came here that the irony is that I have to leave this meeting to go give a talk on Portuguese travelers in India. And, they're Portuguese travelers in India. So, those are some of the themes that, I hope that you'll keep in mind as we go along. And again, if you have any questions or comments during the course of the talk, then please feel free to just raise your hand or just say something. Okay, so does anybody know who this is? A+, very good. Everyone got that right. Now, anyone know what year Vasco landed in India? Oh, you guys did your homework, huh? So, at the close of the 15th century, Vasco lands. Does anyone know where he landed? Yes. You guys should give this lecture. Huh? Now, here's another question. What was Vasco da Gama and others, especially in regard to the Portuguese, I'm saying, what was he coming to India for? What was he in search of? Trade, yes. Spices, yes.
The expansion of the Portuguese Empire.
Yes. There's one key thing that no one has said yet, and I'll give you a hint. The hint is in this picture. So not exactly conversion, but you're on the right track. Not even spreading. They were actually out to find other Christians. Because there were many myths floating around about like Prester John and this kingdom of Christians somewhere in the east that maybe could help them in their battles against the Moors or whoever else they wanted to fight. Brother Christians in the east. This was really one of the major things that they were in search of. Let us find these Eastern Christian communities. And not even necessarily, they're already Christian, so there might have been some conversion that happened later, although that's a whole other topic, which actually you might tell us more about, Leslie. But really, they wanted allies, Christian allies in the East, who could, bring their forces and attack from that side. All of these ideas were floating around at that time. So, number one thing they wanted definitely was spices, things to trade, commodity items. But the other thing, and this is a very important thing they wanted, were to find these Christian brothers in the East and sisters. Yes, sir?
Was it a gimmick to get some grants from the government to support the expedition?
Who? I'm sorry?
I don't think so. The idea that they were looking for, that the one purpose of the whole expedition was to look for Christians.
Yes.
May have been just a gimmick to get funds from the government to support.
A pretext. Well, the government themselves, Manuel and the later kings, they were very much involved in this same idea of finding, because, like I'm saying, these brothers would become allies to help them in their own battles. And they were excited by this. So it was very much in the interest of the state to have these kinds of allies also.
Okay.
Okay, so this
Sorry.
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. My question was that you said that they were looking for allies. So this search for allies, was it directed towards the Islamic Empire, or was it directed towards something else as well?
More to the Islamic empires, yes.
Right. So it was basically for just fighting them off.
Yes. And not only fighting them off I mean, obviously they're too far away in Europe, but to fight them off in the Holy Lands and all the other larger empires that were there that India had closer access to, that they couldn't get troops to come from that side. It was like, they were imagining like a big, move from east and west that would kind of take care of this large behemoth of a Islamic empire in the middle.
Thank you.
Okay, now why this is important is because I bring this up because I want to start with this first description that we have from Vasco's time, then we'll move to some other guys, and I'll end with, again, another description which will contrast with this first one. So try to keep this first excerpt in your mind. Why I'm mentioning it is because you have to understand the context with what is in their minds when they're coming. Right? Because how you see things in the world, how you even perceive, objects of the world are so, I don't want to say clouded, but colored or whatever, are influenced by what you have in your mind already, your preconceived notions and ideas. So you have to have in your mind that these guys are coming, knowing very well that we're going to land up in this place called India, we're going to get down, and there's going to be Christians everywhere. That is what they came thinking. So Vasco never wrote a big kind of memoir of his travels, but there was one guy on the ship, well, there were a few ships, but one of the ships had somebody that we still don't know who it is, still semi-anonymous ship person. We don't know if he was an admiral or he was probably a little bit higher class than, just a, ship hand kind of person, but we still don't know who it is. Some people think it was Vasco's younger brother, but that has not been proved. So we don't really know who it is, and to be quite frank, for our purposes, it's not that important. But he wrote a detailed description of that first voyage, the first voyage of Vasco da Gama to India, 1498. So, a lot of this lecture will be excerpts from these Portuguese chronicles, right? This is all about what did these travelers do when they came to India and what did they see. So I'll be reading a lot of those excerpts. You can follow along on the slides. And this one is particularly one of my favorites. I mean, and you'll see how interesting it is with this perception, with this concept in your mind of why these guys are coming here and what they're doing. So, when we disembarked, the captain major once more entered his palanquin. The road was crowded with a countless multitude anxious to see us. Even the women came out of their houses with children in their arms and followed us. When we arrived at Calicut, they took us to a large church. And this is what we saw. The body of the church is as large as a monastery, all built of hewn stone and covered with tiles. At the main entrance rises a pillar of bronze as high as a mast, on top of which was perched a bird, apparently a cock. In addition to this, there was another pillar as high as a man and very stout. In the center of the body of the church rose a chapel, all built of hewn stone with a bronze door sufficiently wide for a man to pass, and stone steps leading up to it. Within this sanctuary stood a small image which they said represented Our Lady. That would be, Mary. Along the walls by the main entrance hung 7 small bells. In this church, the captain major said his prayers, and we with him. We did not go within the chapel, for it is the custom that only certain servants of the church, called kafis, that's basically people who are non-Muslim, should enter. These kafis wore some threads passing over the left shoulder and under the right arm in the same manner as our deacons wear the stole. They threw holy water over us and gave us some white earth, which the Christians of this country are in the habit of putting on their foreheads, breasts, around the neck, and on the forearms. They threw holy water upon the captain major and gave him some of the earth, which he gave in charge of someone, giving them to understand that he would put it on later. Many other saints were painted on the walls of the church, wearing crowns. They were painted variously with teeth protruding an inch from the mouth and 4 or 5 arms. Below this church there was a large monastery tank, similar to many others which we had seen along the road. Now this is a description. When they get off, they get taken to a church, and this is what this man saw. Now, what kind of a church is this? Yeah, exactly. It's a Hindu temple. You can clearly see all the markings of, very perfectly described. The Gopuram, moving in, the main stamba when you come in, the Garbhagriha, the inner sanctum. You'll find another description a little later, and you'll get a nice contrasted perspective. The idol, he thinks, is some kind of Mother Mary figure, right? Anything else you can pick up? Yeah, describes the Brahmin exactly. Anything else? Some others? The paintings that have 4 or 5 arms. Yeah, exactly. Very good. When did you see a saint with 4 or 5 arms? No, a saint. So you're getting confused too. We moved past that, yeah. Brahma is there, that's fine. But he's not a saint. Yeah, the teeth, some Rakshasas are there. When did you see a saint with protruding teeth? But they thought, what I'm trying to say is, it's not like they saw these things and said, oh, this is not Christianity. They thought, this is Christianity, but this is the type that they practice here in the East. This is like their Christianity. So no problem. We're happy, they have a different system, but, and then he makes comparisons, right? When he talks about the Brahmin thread, he says it's kind of like how our deacons wear their thing. So I'm stressing this point because it's your mind. It is your context that you're coming with. It is your preconceived notions with so much influence what you actually see and how you see it. And of course, this was the first time that the Portuguese had landed up in India. Now, within a very short amount of time, the Portuguese, they already had some good connections in the south of Africa. They had made some inroads into taking over Hormuz, which is the big trading spot that goes out of the Red Sea. And within 10, 15 years, they had pretty much arrested full control of Indian Ocean trade. Amazing what the Portuguese did. In the 16th century was like the Portuguese century. By 1510, Goa is under Portuguese control. So within 12 years of this landing. Incredibly rapid, the expansion of Portuguese, you could say overseas empire, yes. Although, this is another interesting thing to keep in mind, is that the Portuguese methodology of empire building was very different than, let us say, what the British were doing. Although both were at some fundamental level founded upon trade. For a large part of it, the Portuguese were not interested in controlling land, moving into the hinterlands of the country. All of their empire was basically a coastal thing that went all the way Africa, India, all the way to Macau, into China, then made it up to Japan later. So they were very coastal, very limited to that kind of maritime power. They were not so interested in, sending large troops and armies and, making their way into the actual interior of these countries. So they did send people to make alliances and trade contacts with people in these inner areas. So the next section that we're going to go to, and pretty much the remainder of the talk will be drawn from these 2 Portuguese chroniclers, Domingo Paes and Fernando Nunes. These 2 were basically horse merchants. One actually spent time at Vijayanagara during the reign of Krishnadevaraya, and another one was at Vijayanagara but a little bit after. And he reflects more on the history of Vijayanagara. But both of these merchants had very intimate connection with Vijayanagara, spent time in India, considerable amount of time in India, and their recollections are very, very vivid, very precise, at least from what we can, understand from the data they've given us. And they give us a picture of Vijayanagara life that we would otherwise not have. Not in toto, but there's a lot of things they talk about that no other source mentions. So these two merchants apparently wrote down their memoirs and had sent it to Goa, which was then the head of Portuguese power in India, Casa da India. And these two were bundled together and then sent to Lisbon, where there were also historians already writing histories of the Portuguese in India by that time. So this was maybe in the late 16th century. Already, people in Portugal were writing history of India, or history of Portuguese in India. So you just see the difference in, that desire for creating history, writing history, documenting stuff is amazing. So these two were put together in one bundle. And that's kind of how they've been preserved. I think it's in Paris, actually, is the original one still. So there was a Britisher named Robert Sewell who got these, translated them, wrote a very nice book which is basically the source material that we have here, and an excellent kind of introduction to Vijayanagara from his perspective, called, anyone know the name of this book? It's called Vijayanagara, A Forgotten Empire. A Forgotten Empire. Forgotten because, well, maybe he thought that no one was in India remembered it much. Hampi was not, like a big place. I mean, it's still not a big tourist destination, and people don't really go so much to Hampi. Has anyone ever been to Hampi? 1, 2, 3 people, 4 people. It's spectacular. It's spectacular. You must go. I mean, one thing that I felt when I was there, besides the fact that it was there's something very mystical about those rocks. And when the sun sets on those kind of gold color rocks, then they kind of turn red color. And I mean, it's just spectacular. But in addition to that kind of beauty, a lot of times you'll go to a historical site in India, you get your, the ASI card or whatever they have, monuments card, you pay the ticket, you get the card, you go in, there's a gate, you go in, you see everything, and then you come out. Hampi is not like that at all. Hampi is a whole huge, abandoned city kind of place with rivers here, boulders there, and you can go on hiking in all these different places. I mean, it's like a world that you enter. It's also considered, they call it Kishkinda. This is also the area of, everybody knows Kishkinda, okay. Hanuman's place. Yes, the land of the Vanaras. So there's something very special about that place. You should definitely go and check it out. Now, but a lot of research was not being done. There is definitely popular memory about Vijayanagara. If you ask a Telugu guy or a Kannadiga, who's a great king, usually they'll say Krishnadevaraya. I don't know. Maybe they won't. Any Telugu? And they're the ones that have been to Hampi. Yeah, I mean, Krishnadevaraya had a very famous saying. Anyone know that one about Telugu? Desha Bhasha Landu. So, Desha Bhasha, amongst the regional language, Telugu Lessa. Telugu is the best one. Now, all Telugus, of course, repeat that all the time. They don't even know who Krishnadevaraya is. Huh? Surya? Who's Krishnadevaraya? Great king. Yes. Telugu was his language. Sorry, I'll mention why I'm bringing this stuff up. Technically, Hampi is in Karnataka. But in those days, and still actually, there's large parts of Karnataka where people still speak Telugu. But in those days, there wasn't all this Karnataka, Andhra Pradesh stuff. There were bunches of languages that were all working. So if you went to the court at Vijayanagara, you might hear Tamil, you might hear Kannada, you might hear Old Telugu, you might hear Sanskrit, you will definitely, also find some Persian. And, what he was getting at was most of the lords, he says no one ever goes to the previous lines of that famous verse. So in the previous line of that verse, he says, when all the kings, all the lords in your land have gathered at the court, Yella Nurpul Kolovan Eragave Basari. Didn't you understand after they spoke? Did you not understand that Telugu is the best? Because he's saying that most of your vassals, your doras, your lords were all basically speaking Telugu. So you better start sponsoring that in order to, garner that kind of local support. That was the main thing. And a lot of that came from the disintegration of the Kakatiya Empire. So a lot of those guys were coming into the service of Vijayanagara. Anyway, this verse is from one book, one kavya, Mahakavya, written in Telugu by Krishnadevaraya himself, called Amukta Malyada. Now that book the root story is about Andal, the Tamil saint, Bhakti singer. But there's lots of other stuff in there. As most kavyas have so many other things, this one also has a lot of other things. One of the things it has in there is there's a section in chapter 4 where one king basically decides to renounce the kingdom. And then this young boy becomes the king. So when the young boy becomes king, he, he's not sure what he's very confused about what to do. He's too young. So this retiring king basically says, let me tell you some things about governance. And then this is the opportunity for the king to then write down almost 100 verses on Rajaniti. And when you read this section of the text, you can clearly see that it was written by Krishnadevaraya, because there's been some doubt about that. How could a king write something like this? Well, kings were good, man. I mean, they could write. And there's many examples of poet kings and philosopher kings. So I find very good evidence that it was written by him, and you find some very, very specific information about things about the Vijayanagara court, like the Portuguese, which I've also included in this talk, and which also gets back to our original kind of question about history. Do we really have history? One big critique from the Western perspective is that you have lots of literature. India is famous for all, I think there was one quote in Michelle's talk yesterday. A lot of literature, all of this kavya, these beautiful flowers and bees and animals. That's all good, but that's kind of just this fanciful kind of very nice poetic literature. But what do we notice is there are parts of texts that also can kind of shift into a historical mode. That's what Narayana Rao and Subramaniam and Shulman call textures of time. I don't know if anyone's ever read that book. You should check that book out. It's about historical consciousness in medieval India. And that's what they're getting at, that texture. That when you read it, when someone who's in the culture reads a text like that, I can pick out when he's being poetic and describing, huge mountains or mansions that touch the sky. You can know that he's kind of hyperbolizing in that poetic mode. And then when he goes to another section on Rajaniti, you can tell that he's not really exaggerating here. He's talking some real stuff. And it's a beautiful section of the text, which I'll quote partially from as well. Okay, so that's kind of the introduction to what's coming next. Excerpts from these two Portuguese merchants and a few kind of, opportunities to look at Krishnadevaraya's own words about his empire and what he thought about particularly the Portuguese that we're visiting. So any questions up until this point? Okay. So yes, Vijayanagara, let's see, when these guys came to India, to Vijayanagara. This is now post that Vasco da Gama time. So we're done with the, I think I found Christians here. They soon enough figured out that, okay, these guys are not Christians at all. There are Christians here, but that's different. Most of these other guys are not Christians. They're whatever, Hindus or whatever, and they're doing their own thing. And slowly they integrated, and, as I was saying, Goa became the base. And you have to realize that trade was their main thing. Trade was the main thing. And you had to get also trade connections from the inner empires. So Vijayanagara was a key empire. So if you want to trade, if you want spices, you want your pepper, and you want your... Pepper was the main thing, actually, in India. Pepper was a huge thing. So if you want this pepper and other things, what do you need? You have to have something that the other guys want, right? That's how trade works. So what was it that the Portuguese had that Vijayanagara wanted? Anybody? Yes, sir. Very good, sir. Horses is the right answer. They had now taken control of the Middle Eastern trade kind of ports, major ones. And basically now we're in control of the importation of horses. Now, why were horses so important? Yes. Yes. These were the #1 key to winning a battle in medieval India. Whoever had the best horses would win. Now you have to see, we're around 1510, 1520, around that time. What's going on in North India? Yes, Mughal Empire is in full force. Those overland routes are now cut off from the Deccan, so you couldn't bring horses in through Afghanistan. Like at some point they did do that. These routes were kind of cut off. 1526, we're past Delhi Sultanate. Yeah. The first battle was earlier, though, I think. Let's look that up. Someone. What was the first battle of Panipat? 1526. Good. So that means that at this time, we're not even at the Mughal Empire. Is that what you're saying? Yeah. But soon after, or almost contemporaneous. But yes, so things were not good. Things were not in a place to conduct trade. Yeah. So those roads were cut off. So the only way you could get the horses in was through sea. And you needed these ports, like there are many ports on the eastern coast, but now Goa was becoming the main port that we had to import horses from. So the other thing was, there were other guys that were also here, that were not the Mughals, that were not the Delhi Sultanate. Anyway, there's another kind of set of empires that are in this Deccan zone near Vijayanagara. No. They're not an empire, really. They were in employment of the empire. But there was a Siddhi king that had a lot of power in one of these. Yes, you got it. The Bahmanis, which then split into these 5 other mini-states, they were the main kind of rival to Vijayanagara. And it was against those guys that they needed these horses. Now, one of the things that Sewell, the guy that put this book together, wrote in his introduction, and again, this links back to the kind of history that we perceive or understand or are taught, was that Vijayanagara was the stronghold of Hinduism in the south that protected Hindu culture during the onslaught of Islam. And, a lot of people still kind of hold on to that narrative. But when you look at the information, when you look at the data, I mean, I just said Vijayanagara was fighting with these Bahmanis, which were mostly Islamic kingdoms. But it wasn't because they were Islamic. They were just another guy. Because Vijayanagara also fought with the Gajapatis in Orissa, who were Hindu. So there wasn't anything that I have read that really made the Vijayanagara Bahmani, or like Bijapur was their biggest enemy, confrontation one of religious ideology by any stretch of the imagination. It was simply another, empire to fight for power, for, more land, whatever it may be. But having it be a religiously driven kind of antagonism is certainly not, borne out by the data. There was just as much antagonism towards Gajapatis or other, other empires in the south that many of the Vijayanagara kings took out or controlled. Yes?
But why do we see many kings of specifically Islamic kingdoms acquiring the title of Ghazi after waging a war on a quote-unquote Hindu kingdom? Babur took it.
Yeah.
There are many other instances wherein they take that, and Ghazi literally translates into holy war.
Yeah.
I mean, is it too much of an overread into the facts, or does it hold true?
What I think is that the drive was not that, but sometimes used as kind of like motivating factors, and then getting those titles then reinforced kind of ideas of difference or whatever. But I don't think that, ideologically, even in Babur, if you read Babur's memoirs, what a beautiful man. I mean, you want to read a great memoir of a king, read Babur. He's the most amazing. Baburnama is one of the best. I mean, really. And you read that thing and you don't find that kind of thinking in him from his own mouth. But I think, and there's a lot of good research being done on this. See, these things like these titles. The titles are not really for that person. It's a proclamation to everyone else. And it was usually a proclamation to the other Islamic kingdoms further west to say, this is what we've done. And this gives us some kind of legitimacy in your kind of Islamic world, hierarchy. So we have to do more research. But honestly, I don't know as much about that period. But here, I don't find any of that stuff. Anyway, there's a lot of information about even Krishnadevaraya taking on, the title of Sultan, this, right? Wearing the robes, because at that point, those were kind of like the political markers of your sovereignty. So it was like a culture. It wasn't, the religion of Islam per se. That's what I would say. Okay. So you have to realize when these guys got here, it was like, sometimes when I think when my dad went to America in, early 70s, and, we grew up in a village, didn't have much stuff at home, and he lands up in New York one fine day. That awe of seeing those big buildings, cars racing around, all the roads, everything. That kind of wonder is like what these guys were experiencing. Lisbon was a decent-sized city, but it was nothing compared to the mass and wealth that they saw in India. And so these next few examples will show you that kind of adbhutam that this guy had when he landed up. And if you go to Hampi, you will still see this street. It's beautiful. It's a very well laid out main road with the merchant shops on the sides. You can clearly see that. And then the temple is further to one side. So going forward, you have a broad and beautiful street full of rows of fine houses and streets of the sort I have described. And it is to be understood that the houses belong to men rich enough to afford such. In this street live many merchants, and there you will find all sorts of rubies and diamonds and emeralds and pearls and seed pearls and clothes and every other sort of thing there is on earth and that you may wish to buy. Then you have there every evening a fair where they sell many common horses and nags. And this is interesting, you know, there's a difference between the country-bred horse, that is the indigenous Indian horse, and the imported, more sturdy, robust horse of the Middle East. And that's a key thing in this whole trade triangle that was happening between Vijayanagara, the Middle East, via the Portuguese, and Bijapur. And also many citrons and limes and oranges and grapes and every other kind of garden stuff and wood. You have all in this street. At the end of it, you have another gate with its wall, which wall goes to meet the wall of the second gate, of which I have spoken in such sort that this city has 3 fortresses, within another which is the king's palace. So it's pretty, you know, that abundance. When they got here, that's what they saw. Richness, abundance, people. And here you'll get now, this course was supposed to be focused on society, right? The different kinds of people. So I've tried to pick some passages that talk about, you know, what was the life like? What were the different kinds of people like? So the hollows and valleys between the boulder-covered heights were filled with habitations, poor and squalid doubtless in most instances, but interspersed with the stone-built dwellings of the nobles, merchants, and upper classes of the vast community, except where the elaborately constructed water channels of the rayas enabled the land to be irrigated. And these parts, rich gardens and woods, and luxurious crops of rice and sugarcane abounded. Here and there were wonderfully carved temples and fanes, that's like also a temple, to Hindu deities. And I thought you would like this one, Michelle, we should look into this. With Brahmanical colleges and schools attached the more important amongst their number. Now, I don't know what exactly these Brahmanical colleges and schools are, but it would be interesting to do some research into that. Maybe like some patshala next to a temple or next to someone's home, or in the very traditional way that people used to learn, just sitting on the veranda with one guru just being there. That could have been that type of style. But we do know in Bijapur there was a huge college in Bijapur. Actually. No, in Bidar. Sorry, not Bijapur. In Bidar had a huge college, of course, of a very different type of training. But still, the idea of education was important. So I'm just reading these out so you start to get an image and a feeling of what things are like. Then when this gate is passed, you have another street where there are many craftsmen, and they sell many things. And in this street there are 2 small temples. There are temples in every street, for these appertain to institutions like the co-fraternities you know of in our parts. Now this is interesting. Again, making that comparison to what you know, which is also a part of the translating process. You know, you hear a word, you don't understand it, you try to think of something in your own mind, in your own consciousness that relates to it, and then you make these connections. So maybe these were some kind of guilds, right? We're talking about artisans and, their fraternities. So some type of guild, we could think, of all the craftsmen and merchants. But the principal and greatest pagodas are outside the cities. Now, pagodas here, he means temples. That's basically their word. In this street lodged Krishnadevaraya de Figueiredo. Now, we'll come back to this guy in a little bit. He was also a horse merchant who was extremely important when there was the battle for Raichur. Right in the middle of the Krishna and Tungabhadra, where they kind of split, there's a kind of a key area. Raichur. There's a fort there. Bijapur and Vijayanagara had kind of gone back and forth with this fort for many years. But at this time, it was under Bijapur control. Krishnadevaraya went with his troops, had a siege going on at that place, was not doing well. I mean, they were just waiting and waiting. These guys had a huge fort that they could not penetrate. And then suddenly these Portuguese merchant guys, I don't know what they were doing, just showed up. At least that's how we hear about it in the text. And says, let us help you. We have these rifles. And so they would just wait, sitting there, for some guy to peek out of the turret there and finish. That guy would die, and like that and then apparently one time the leader of that fort also, said, let me check out what's going on. And then They finished that guy off and then finished. So, and this, Richard Eaton says, although, I mean, I don't know, was the first use of firearms in the interior of India. So this would have been around 1520 or so. So the Portuguese also brought that kind of technology with them. But after that battle, Krishnadevaraya, of course, thanks this guy immensely, says, you have to come back to my kingdom and I'll show you all sorts of nice things. And he was also a horse merchant, so they made good dealings, and he'll come up in a little while when we get further into it. So he had housed him in the city. On every Friday you have a fair there with many pigs and fowls and dried fish from the sea and other things the produce of the country, of which I do not know the name. And in like manner a fair is held every day in different parts of the city. At the end of the street, now this is important, at the end of the street is the Moorish quarter, which is at the very end of the city. And of these Moors there are many who are natives of the country and who are paid by the king and belong to his guard. So these were, in a sense, mercenaries. Also not the foreign imported Muslims that many times were coming to Bijapur. Like Bijapur, the sultans would call, poets and artists and various people, scholars of different kinds, from Persia, from Iraq, from different places in the Islamic world to come and be in their court. These were not that type. These were native guys, he's saying, right? So that's important. And they were paid and they were kept in the city. In this city you will find men belonging to every nation and people because of the great trade which it has. And the many precious stones there, principally diamonds. So I again want to stress this point, that kind of cosmopolitan nature of this place like Vijayanagara was really because of the trade. And it didn't matter if you were Muslim, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, or whatever. If you had the goods to sell, you wanted to make a deal, let's do it. That was the driving thing. Another, one of my old teachers, his whole thing was about loyalty. That your religious affiliation was not the main issue, but it was your sense of loyalty to whatever person it was. And that was the kind of driving mechanism. Because you had many people moving. You had people that were once, in fact, even now I'm thinking, Krishnadevaraya's son-in-law used to work for one of the Baminis for a while, and then came back and married Krishnadevaraya's daughter. So it was a porous border in terms of that kind of allegiance. But the main thing was, who were you, going to be loyal to? Who was the person that you were going to, pledge yourself to? And that wasn't based, at least not solely, maybe partially, but not solely on your religious identity. Okay, so let's talk more about these merchants and that particular horse merchant that I was telling you about. When we came to this country, the king was in his new town, and there went to see him Cristóvão Figueiredo with all of us Portuguese that came with him, and all very handsomely dressed after our manner, with much finery. The king received him very well and was very complaisant to him. The king was as much pleased with him as if he had been one of his own people. So much attention did he evince towards him, and also towards those among us who went with him he showed much kindness. We were so close to the king that he touched us all and could not have enough of looking at us. Here he, Krishnaraya, commanded us to be lodged in some very good houses. Now make note of this point because I'm going to come back to it. Lodged in some very good houses, and in the previous quote you also heard that he was lodged in a nice. And Figueiredo was visited by many lords and captains and other persons who came on behalf of the king. And the king sent him many sheep and fowls and many vessels full of butter and honey and many other things to eat. The king said many kind and pleasant things to him and asked him concerning the kind of state which the king of Portugal kept up. And having been told about it all, he seemed much pleased. So you can see that the king was very interested in, it's almost like how Professor Jain right now is upstairs with those guys, giving them nice lunch, being very nice, we want to make a deal, we want to be, please sit down, I'm going to spend time with you. It's same. To me, it's like that. Yes?
So can this description be corroborated by an Indian account?
Boss, did you look at my lecture already? Did you look at my lecture already? You must have. That's exactly what I'm doing, is corroborating that with these poems in Amuktamayada during that Rajaniti section. So this is now, this 4258, this is from that section. Merchants from distant lands who import elephants and war horses should be kept in imperial service at the capital. Treat them with prestige and provide them with towns and mansions. Purchase their goods at a high price and assure that your enemies are deprived of such resources. Now, if this does not relate to what we just read, I don't know what does. Because another thing we know is that, you see, the Portuguese were quite smart. So, they went to Vijayanagara, they said, yeah, we have all these great horses, pay us this stuff, and we'll give you the horses, and then we'll even help you fight those Bijapur guys, man, that you don't like very much. And then the next month, he would send another guy to Bijapur and say, yeah, we have all these horses, and if you just give us this money, we'll help you fight those Vijayanagara guys. So they just kept on, figuring out which one was going to pay more, which one would be more lucrative, who seemed stronger at the time. And so he knows that too. Now, Raya knows that, which is why he's adding that last part. And it was true, that's exactly what he did. He paid way more money than he should have paid for those horses. Not because he was valuing the horses more, but because he wanted to make sure that Bijapur would never get a slice of this pie. And he says that here, purchase their goods at a high price and ensure that your enemies are deprived of such. Clearly is written this. Now, before I was saying that, it's this trade, it's this mercantile kind of culture, it's this want to, have merchants and sponsor trade. But a lot of that trade was fundamentally based in war, like the horses themselves, and the money that was basically coming into the Portuguese coffers back in Lisbon. All of that was driving this imperial machine. So you have to realize that underneath it is a certain sense of war. And this is also a quote from the Portuguese guys. Because when Cristóvão first came and said, let me help you win Raichur, he was like, come on, it's okay, you guys are like visitors here. You shouldn't be doing that. You're business people here. But then he very clearly said that we're here for war, man. And war, at some level, was underlying all of it. Even though business was important, there was also an aspect of war underlying the whole thing. Yes?
How do foreigners bring elephants?
Yeah, that's a good question. So he was probably not... see, what happens is a lot of times, this is again now a critique of poetry. Sometimes things come together. Gaja Ashwa might come as like a dwandwa, like a samasa that comes together. Or they could be talking about, a lot of the elephants they actually got from much further south. So he could be talking about those guys.
But they were not considered foreigners.
Right, they weren't really foreigners. You're right. But they could be considered merchants from distant lands. Yes. Maybe not so distant, but further away. But yes, that's correct, sir. They were not importing elephants, no. They're not like Hannibal.
How does the concept of foreigner fit in this particular context? What did we define, or what did they define as a foreigner?
It's a really good question.
So someone someone from North India was also a foreigner to them as someone from Portugal, or how did it work?
I don't think the North Indian or the South Indian, deep South Indian, were nearly, they weren't really foreign. They were just different but local. Whereas these guys are definitely foreign. Yeah. Yeah. No, but you're right in the sense that there was certainly difference. The thing that really connected them, at least if you look at like, Vijayanagara and these Bijapur and Ahmednagar and Bidar and all these places, there was now a kind of cosmopolitan culture of like what political power entailed. So at least at a courtly level, right, in terms of governance, I think they were starting to, percolate a new kind of expression of what this political power was like, which also meant having things like Persian at your court. I mean, if the Delhi Sultanate and the Mughals soon later were going to have Persian as a major language, then you should also know those languages. You should also be able to read their messages when they come. You got to have translators at your court. You got to have all this stuff. It became like a new type of cosmopolitan culture, is what I'm trying to argue for. That, at least in India, was there. Now, if you bring the Portuguese and then later French and Dutch and English, they were different. I think they were definitely foreign. And, this also has to do with the fact that, there is something that was connecting India, whether it be an empire or not. This subcontinental area, people had some shared understanding of culture to an extent that even if you were different, even if you spoke a different language, even if you were a different religion, you could still identify with them on some other level, which you could not, arguably, was available to French or, Portuguese.
When the British came, it was seen as a conquest.
No, but the British also came for trade.
Right, they came as a trade, but the concept of foreigner, they didn't see them as foreigners because they were getting value out of this business. Whilst the British Empire, something soon began that colonialism, the idea of colonialism takes place.
Yeah, I mean, more to the British, you're saying? And less to these guys? Possibly. And like I'm saying, the Portuguese stayed on the coast. It's like they were there, but they weren't like imposing with their presence, I would say. The way that the British were, yeah. So in that sense, possibly. Whether or not that makes them feel more foreign, possibly. I don't know. These are good questions. And I don't have a clear-cut answer. Yeah, good question. So I don't have some of that stuff here, but Vijayanagara has a lot of sculpture on the temples and other places where you can see there's definitely examples of guys holding horses. But whether or not they're Portuguese or not, actually they might be because the hat is a little bit different. So I think we could say that there's some depiction, but not as clear-cut as, like this stuff that we find. But yeah, I mean, we don't have much Portuguese stuff that I know of from this period of painting Vijayanagara. So most of it is still also their written description.
Okay. And was this notion of foreigner, just adding to whatever everyone else was asking, like, was it always people who came from the sea? Like, were they considered foreigners?
So that's a big part of it, I think. That's a big part of it. I think the sea does mark those boundaries of India. I mean, from ancient times, that was the kind of conception of India. You had the Himalayas here, you had two oceans, and we were this triangle there, and like everything is kind of there. And no matter how different everyone is in that zone, at least they're bound by these three sides, and there's something that connects us all that's there. And if you come from beyond that, from somewhere in the ocean, then yes, maybe you are foreign. Of course, there was the people came in through, the northwest too. There was an opening there to come in, which many people came. But Yes, that's a good question. And maybe they were considered a little foreign also at some point. But, you know, that's where like the, you know, the sultanates, you know, they're different in the sense that people came in and then they sat and they stayed and they lived and they became here only. That's why this guy can talk about native Muslims, right, in that sense. So there's all sorts of varieties of this influx of people, how much they settle, on what side do they settle, do they go inside, do they become part of the society, all of that stuff. I mean, obviously, you know, you have someone like Amir Khusro. I mean, you know, his mother was Indian, his father was from Persia, maybe somewhere, we're not sure. But, you know, some people say he was the first Indian Muslim because he had that indigenous blood in him. And then that goes on for centuries. People are just as Indian as anybody else. Okay, let's keep going. Here's some more from Amuktamalida. When buying elephants, horses, or fodder, paying the salaries of good soldiers, honoring Brahmins, or indulging in personal pleasures, expense is not a waste, it is gain. I mean, this was a great king, man. He knew how to live life, really. And if you read Amuktamalida, his description of food is just, I mean, superb, man. It's fantastic. And actually, I'll read you a bunch of verses about his life, too, which are interesting. So Paes notes the dispensation of graded salaries, and Nunes adds to this list with a number of day workers. So they had groomers, trainers, artisans, blacksmiths, carpenters, masons, and others. He also makes specific stable hands, caretakers, and the chief master of horses, someone he calls Madaranque, who was a Muslim, by the way. And a lot of this knowledge of horse care was actually in the hands of these Muslim specialists that they had to get from outside. So that was another important thing, is having these skilled workers to take care of the horses. So one last verse about these horses. Protect your stables at all times and keep them well stocked with the best fodder. And trust the care of finely bred horses and elephants to skilled and loyal servants, never to your lord. So he had a lot of respect for the kind of skilled workmanship of, or the skill set of knowing how to care for horses, look after them, look after their food properly, all of this stuff. So it was a very, very important part of the governance of the state, was taking care of these horses and making sure they were well fed. Okay.
You need to comment on the last 3 words. Never to your Lord.
Yeah, so the lords, what I'm saying is the lords, even though they were, you know, lords, they were high up in position, they didn't have that kind of skill, and he didn't trust them to make sure that the horses were well looked after. So he's saying that you have to give the job of looking at these horses over to someone who has a lot of skill, even though he might not be a big lord or somebody, but you have to put trust in those guys with that skill set. That was the thing.
You probably didn't want the lords to know how to take care of the horses.
Maybe. Maybe the lords were too busy eating food. So here's the Gajashala at Hampi. And I mean, I just show you because it's a beautiful thing to see. But you also, I mean, we're not going to get into architecture today, but you can clearly see the syncretism in architecture that goes on. And if you go to Hampi, you'll see this in a lot of places. Right? The dome, you see how these are. I mean, they're quite beautiful. Okay, so here's the king. Now this is what Paes tells us about the king's daily life. So what does a king do in you know, the early 16th century? This king is accustomed every day to drink a quartillo, 3/4 of a pint, of the oil of gingerly, that's sesame or some kind of something that we're not sure. Okay, he drinks this A pint, 3/4 of a pint of this oil. I mean, you get the image here. But then I'm going to show you something in the next verse that will make this very interesting. So he drinks this oil, right? And from before daylight, and he anoints himself all over with this same oil. So now he's drinking it, and he's like, he covers his loins with a small cloth and takes in his arms great weights made of earthenware. And then, taking his sword, he exercises himself with it till he has sweated out all the oil. So there was a technique going on here. And then he wrestles with one of his wrestlers. After this labor, he mounts a horse and gallops about the plain in one direction and another till dawn, for he does all this before daybreak. So he used to get up very early to, work his body. Now, this is a modern kind of picture of Krishnadevaraya. Looks nice, big mush, it's looking good. Looks decent. Now, this is interesting because unlike any other king, there aren't many figures at all from this period where we have a clear description of their physical attributes. Because again, and I'll show you in the next picture, this was not kind of the important, you didn't talk about this stuff. If you did want to portray yourself, you portrayed yourself in this idyllic, perfect, regal manner. No one wants to hear about smallpox, man. Right? So this is what Paes says. The king is of medium height and a fair complexion and good figure, rather fat than thin. He has on his face signs of smallpox. Now, does that look like what we hear? Maybe. A little bit. And there's a lot of other descriptions that talk about the kind of, actual clothing that he wears. But you feel like this isn't an accurate representation? You don't see the smallpox. He's looking thin. He's not looking fat. Right? Then look at this. What is this? Anyone know where this is from? Tirupati. Anyone been to Tirupati? You didn't see this. Nobody sees this because you're so much in a rush to see Venkateshwara that you don't see this. Because it is very difficult to get your darshan there and you've waited for hours and man, you want to see him and go home. So this is right outside the kind of larger enclosure in the main sanctum. And so basically, Krishnadevaraya and his two wives, Tirumala Devi and Chinna Devi, they're all standing outside of that praying directly to the idol. So when you're walking in, if you look back, you'll see these statues there. So now you look at this statue. This was commissioned by the king himself. Now, does that look like a thin guy with signs of smallpox? Not at all. But that didn't matter. What do they call it? Verisimilitude. The closeness to the reality of the picture. It was not an issue with these guys. King said make some statues of him. They made some nice statues. It made the king look nice. The other thing that people have discussed is that cap he's wearing. That cap is not a typical cap. It's actually a different type of cap. And we won't get into that cap. You should read Richard Wagner's article, which we'll read in class. It's a very good article about. Yes. It's not a fez exactly, but it's Turkic and inspired. So here's what King says about himself. At dawn, before the physicians ask, "Did you sleep well?" a king should consult his Brahmin astrologers. After this, he should meet with his accountants to discuss state finances before assembling his ministers and lords. In the middle of the day, before training with wrestlers and masseuses, you see that? Wrestlers and masseuses, same as the other description. At maybe a different time of day, but that was key. Before training with wrestlers and masseuses, a king should chat with cooks, farmers, and hunters. And as the day turns, he should honor venerable yogis and righteous men before worshipping the gods. Then, after eating, a king should enjoy old stories told by poets, that's Puranas, before being entertained by his jester. And in the evening, he should be with dancers and singers, and in the night, with his lover before a good night's rest. Now, that sounds like a good day, right? But what I want to point out is, he's not just hanging out with like the queen and the lords. Look at every strata of society he's with. Brahmins, astrologers, accountants, ministers, lords, wrestlers, masseuses, cooks. He says this, it's important to go and chat with the cooks. Why? This is where you find out what's really going on in your house, man. You want to know information? Do you talk to the boss or you talk to the auto rickshaw guy? No, not the boss. The boss won't tell you anything. Yes, exactly, gossip. He needs to know the gossip. That's why he has to go into the kitchen casually, chat with some cooks. The hunter guy has come in with the catch for the day, so he chats with him, he finds out what's happening outside. Very important. Then you have to realize, Krishnadevaraya, as much as I'm talking about this kind of openness that he had towards different religions, which he did, he was a hardcore Sri Vaishnava. Hardcore. And you will find this everywhere in the text, in his text and even in this text, about the kind of ritual activity that he was doing was very much that. And honoring Brahmins, of course, was a big part of his activity. Right, so he has these yogis, then he's with his poets, he's very famous. He had his Ashtadiggajas, these 8 great poets. So he was a big, Rasika himself, writer himself, but mostly a great patron of arts, particularly literature. And then, then he has a little bit of fun at night, right, boys? And that's it, that's his life. Let's see, there's another one. This is important too. The other day we were discussing about, do leaders really think about their people? Are they, maybe today, as a leader, are our leaders concerned with the everyday functioning of, the people of the country? Or are they basically just worried about these, larger kind of ministers and this and that and negotiating those guys and thinking about what's going to happen? At least in the king's mindset, and in many things that he did too, building tanks, this kind of public works, social works, you could see that he was very concerned with people. And the whole metaphor here is that all of society, and you'll kind of hear at the end what that society is like. Again, I'm telling you, he's a very hardcore Sri Vaishnava. That, his body, he's looking after his health. That looking after his health is basically what he feels like he's looking after, the health of the society. That these two things are basically interlocked. And this goes back to a very old, Bhupati, lord of the land, married to the land. If the king is well, the land is well. If the king is well, the people are well. That feeling. So a king should care for the empire like his own body, for the two are one. He should consult physicians as he does ministers and cut back on feasting as well as taxes. He should strengthen his muscles and reduce his fat. That's like getting rid of that oil. Knowing the parts of his body like the wealth in his land. He should be oiled, massaged, and bathed clean, as if crushing and eliminating his enemies. That's like when that oil comes off, it takes off a lot of toxins, right? So it's like that. He should maintain a good complexion and care for his teeth like a well-ordered society headed by Brahmins. So again, very clear this Varna system was in his mind. He understood it. Although there are many sources that say that he was not even from a Kshatriya standard. He was actually a Tulu guy. And some people say a kind of a local warlord type. So he obviously imbibed these things and projected these things as the kind of way to lead and govern. So the king should never forget to keep good health, for affecting his body affects the empire. One more. A king must listen to the cries of the destitute and care for their needs, whilst never entrusting such serious matters to cowards. He must always be ready to protect his people, for if a king keeps the welfare of the people in his heart, the people will care for the welfare of the king. What's the benefit of this, you might ask? When people are high-minded and united in their desires, won't God, who resides in the souls of all beings, be giving? Quite a nice verse. Okay, now let's talk about some other types of people that were the Portuguese were talking about or writing about. Main thing was they were blown away by the population size, the strength of the population. The people in this city are countless in number, so much that I do not wish to write it down, for fear it should be thought fabulous. But I declare that no troops, horse or foot, could break their way through any street or lane. So great are the numbers of the people and elephants. Right? So, I was almost scared to write it down because people are never going to believe me. I'm going to tell them about this amazing place and they're going to be like, yeah, you made all that up. Then to see the grandeur of the nobles and men of rank, I cannot possibly describe it all, nor should I believe if I tried to do so. Then to see the horses and the armor that they wear, you would see them so covered with metal plates that I have no words to express what I saw. And some hid from me the sight of others, and to try and tell of all I saw is hopeless. For I went along, here's the great line, for I went along with my head so often turned from one side to the other that I was almost falling backwards off my horse with my senses lost. The cost of it all is not so much to be wondered at, as there is so much money in the land, and the chiefs are all so wealthy. So you just get this picture of this incredibly vast place. In one other section I remember, he says the only thing you could even compare this to is Rome, which of course at that time still was a huge city. This is interesting. Now, I'm trying to cover it up. Now, this looks like a very standard building. It doesn't have that kind of domed or the curved arch that we saw in the other one. You might just think it's a regular old building, but they've identified this as a mosque, actually. It was used as a mosque for prayer. So the Roy upon this gave orders for the entertainment of Muslimans in his service, allotted them jagirs, erected a mosque for their use in the city of Vijayanagara, that's Vijayanagara, and commanded that no one should molest them in the exercise of their religion. Look at that cosmopolitan tolerance. Note this. Again, coming from a man who at once says, I want an ordered society with Brahmins as the head. These things don't need to be necessarily contradicting, which in today's world, I think sometimes we think that. You can have your personal idea of what you want, but you can also be open and tolerant to others. And there's good examples in our history that show that that's how people were. So you had cooks, merchants, all these guys, whole set of, the Muslim quarter. I mean, this is a very vibrant place. This king is also within his gates more than... Now, this is an interesting passage. Now, see about women here. What this guy tells us about women that you won't even imagine. Let me read it. This king has also within his gates more than 4,000 women, all of whom live in the palace. Some are dancing girls, and others are bearers who carry the king's wives on their shoulders. And the king also in the interior of the palace, for the king's houses are large, and there are great intervals between one house and the... so they need palanquins just to go from like their, sitting room to their bedroom. That's how big this palace is. And if you go to Vijayanagara, you'll get a sense of it. Now here's where it also gets really interesting. He has also women who wrestle, and others who are astrologers. You might have seen this kind of thing before. And soothsayers. And here, and he has women who write all the accounts of expenses that are incurred inside the gates. Women accountants. And others whose duty it is to write all the affairs of the kingdom and compare their books with those of the writers outside. I mean, look at this, man. We don't think we're keeping records. We do. Maybe they got lost over time. Maybe the environment doesn't keep these things the way. Maybe we didn't have the desire to preserve them. Of course, that's another thing in the same way. But accounting is there. Records are there. They were being done. Right? So you have some ladies who are writing the accounts. Then you have other ladies that take those accounts and check it with what's being told out. I mean, it's fascinating, man. So she's making sure that there's no funny business going on from the outside gate and the inside gate. He has women also for music who play instruments and sing. Even the wives of the king are well versed in music. So really, I love that section. Okay, we should... Oh yeah, now the head of society, according to him. Now I'll read this section on Brahmins because it's quite interesting. Again, he automatically compares them to friars, right? You know friars? Not friars. Friars are like monks or priests of a type. So these Brahmins are like friars with us, and they count them as holy men. I speak of the Brahmin priests and the lettered men of the pagodas, because although the king has many Brahmins, now this is really important, although the king has many Brahmins, there are officers of the towns and cities, and belong to the government of them. So what he's saying right there, and I'll show you again a number of verses from Amuktamaya that confer this, that there was definitely a class of Brahmins who were taking care of religious duties, doing ritual work, being specialists in the temple, whatever. But there was also another set that was deeply involved in governance. So just note that. He even says there are other Brahmins who are merchants, and others live by their own property and cultivation, and the fruits which they grow in their inherited grounds. That's their agraharam or whatever they have. Those who have charge of the temples are learned men, and eat nothing which suffers death, neither flesh nor fish nor anything which makes broth red, for they say that it is blood. Some of the other Brahmins who I mention, who seek to serve God and to do penance and to live a life like that of the priests, do not eat flesh or fish or any other thing that suffers death, but only vegetables and butter and other things which they make of fruit with their rice. Now he might right here, I think, be talking about more the yogi type. And he mentions these yogis at one point and says, I can't talk about them now, but I'll get to them later. And then he never gets to them. So we don't get his... I was really looking forward to reading that section. What do both of these guys say about these yogis? But we don't have that. They are all married, right? Which again contrasts with the friar, and have very beautiful wives. The wives are very retiring and very seldom leave the house. The women are of light color, and the caste of these Brahmins are the fairest men and women that there are in the land. This is also an interesting point to note down. For though there are men in other castes commonly of light complexion, yet these are few. There are many in this country who call themselves Brahmins, but they lead a life very different from those of whom I have spoken. For these last are men to whom the king pays much honor, and he holds them in great favor. So you can see, high position of Brahmins, but critical thing is that there's not one type of Brahmin doing one kind of job. Now let's look at a verse. Entrust your forts to loyal Brahmins alone. He made it a policy to give the command of forts to Brahmins and not to his lords. Grant them the bolt to the gate, for by giving unrestricted authority to forts, that's letting them do it as they wish, and making them kind of independent, he felt that creates fear in the enemy. There is no limit to implementing this policy. Give the fort to the Brahmin, allow him some independence that will make your fort secure and also bring a certain sense of fear to the other guy. A fort should be governed by a Brahmin who is from a good family, loyal, well-educated, righteous, and brave. He will stock the citadel with various provisions like tiger's milk cheese to sustain the people for a long time. Now, this tiger's milk cheese, I know it sounds... we don't know what it is. It could be just sour cheese. Because puli is the word in Telugu for lion, but pulupu is the word for sour. So it's probably more on that. But since it said puli in the verse, I gave it this translation. He will maintain the treasury and relieve the people's troubles by spending neither too much nor too little. He will give lands to lords, even if they are tiny as ants, but limit their access. He will see to it that the king and his people are without troubles, and that panic runs through his enemies. And after finding that the enemy is weak by means of spies, right, he's clever, he would seize their land quickly like a heron sparing its prey. With a Brahmin at the head of the fort, the king can rest peacefully, his hand resting gently on his heart. Now, this is another important thing. Even if warriors, peasants, or others imitate the behavior of Brahmins, or even claim to know the laws of society, that is the basic, rules, only a Brahmin will stand his guard in the face of disaster. Therefore, it is always advisable for the king to appoint Brahmins as commanders of forts. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it clearly gives you a sense of what this king thinks of Brahmins and who they are. Okay, now, yes?
What was the role of Kshatriyas then?
So that's a good question. So most of the Doras, the lords, would be of that class. And again, it was not so, when you look at even Kshatriya Varna, that also is getting broken down. Look, because I'm telling you, even this king, Krishnadevaraya, is technically that Kshatriya line, at least not fully, because his mother was not from that group. So it is very tricky in this period of history, that whole dynamic of who is a Kshatriya, who is not a Kshatriya, who should be ruling. But Brahmins seem to have always remained distinctive. Even though, again, their roles, as we've shown, are also quite different and changing. So, yes, that's my answer. So, but what is more important, though, I would say, is that historically, the governance was defined by this Kshatriya-Brahmin relationship, where the king represented, the power, the physical might, the brawn of the machinery of state, whereas the priest would give that religious, almost like, spiritual, otherworldly kind of sanctity to his rule, and bless him with all the things that we meet. And there's huge sections on, the kind of gifts and rituals that, or gifts that the king would give, and then the rituals that the Brahmins would do on behalf of the king, and and the rituals that were also not only just religious, but totally attached to state festivals. Like Navaratri comes, and these guys have a huge religious ceremony, but at the same time, it's the day when all the lords come to the king's court. It's the day when the king pays all the salaries of the lords. So this whole combination between state and religion is an incredibly important one. So whether or not the varnas of the people changed so much, one, I would say, is Brahmins always remained distinct. And two, the other thing that remained important was whoever was in the king position would always need that kind of legitimizing factor from the Brahmin community. Now, we're coming to the end, which is good because we'll have some time for general discussion. Remember what we started with? Yeah, and the description of? So, within 20 years or so, here's some descriptions of churches. Temples. In this pagoda, opposite to its principal gate, which is to the east, there is a very beautiful street of very beautiful houses with balconies and arcades, in which are sheltered the pilgrims that come to it, and there are also houses for the lodging of the upper classes. See, that always there's that distinction. So he's always seeing that social stratification that was present. The king has a palace in the same street, in which he resides when he visits this pagoda. There is a pomegranate tree above this first gate. The gate has a very lofty tower, all covered with rows of men and women and hunting scenes and many other representations. So in that, you also find some Portuguese in these temple sculptures. And as the tower goes narrowing towards the top, so the images diminish in size. Passing this first gate, you come at once into a large courtyard with another gate of the same sort as the first, except that it is rather smaller throughout. And passing this second gate, there is a larger court with verandas all around on pillars of stone, and in the middle of this court is the house of the idol. Now, you have a very kind of analogous type description, right? When you go into the temple, you have to go different stages, and you find both of that kind of description in the first one and this one, right? They're moving in. But there's nothing about Christianity here, right? Now, there's a description that he might not understand, but I hope you will all be able to pick up what he is describing. Opposite the principal gate stand 4 columns, 2 gilded and the other 2 copper, from which, owing to their great age, as it seems to me, the gold has worn off, and the other 2 are also of copper, for all are of copper. That which stands nearest the gate of the temple was given by this king, Krishnadevaraya, who now reigns here, and the others by his predecessors. All the outer side of the gate of the temple up to the roof is covered with copper and gilded, and on each side of the roof on top are certain great animals that look like tigers. That's at Yali. I don't know if you know that dragon-like, tiger-like. As soon as you enter this idol shrine, you perceive from pillar to pillar on which it is supported many little holes in which stand oil lamps, which burn, so they tell me, every night, and they will be in number 2,500 or 3,000 lights. Now here's the part. We're ending with this image that you can try to pick up. As soon as you pass this shrine, you enter another small one like the crypt. Again, this compared like a crypt of some church. It has 2 doors at the sides, and thence onward in this building is like a chapel, where stands the idol which they adore. Now, this is a good line coming up here. Before you get to it there are 3 doors. The shrine is vaulted and dark without any light from the sky. It is always lit with the candles. At the first gate are doorkeepers who never allow anyone to enter except the Brahmins that have charge of it, and I, because I gave something to them. So things don't necessarily change so much. So, he just flipped a little gold coin. Chalo, he got in, right? Between gate and gates are images of little idols. The principal idol is a round stone without any shape. What is it? It's a lingam. They have great devotion for it. This building outside is all covered with copper gilt. At the back of the temple outside, close to the verandas of which I have spoken, there is a small idol. Now watch this. You should all be able to get this one. Small idol of white alabaster with 6 arms. In one it has, and then the text is lost there, and in the other a sword, and the other sacred emblems. And it has below its feet a buffalo, and a large animal which is helping to kill that buffalo. In this pagoda there burns continually a lamp of ghee, and around are other small temples for houses of devotion. So what did he see? Durga killing the Mahishasura. So, you went from one description from 1498 that basically saw the Mother Mary with 6 hands and saints with protruding teeth and all of that to this, which of course still has recourse to things like the crypt and to friars and the chapel and all of those things, but he clearly understands that this is a different culture altogether. It's not Christian, it's not Islamic, it's obviously something else. So, when anyone deals with Vijayanagara history, they cannot not use these sources. They're filled with so much rich information that we don't get so much in the native sources. Now, that's not to say that the indigenous sources are not filled with historical information. They are, and I think I've tried to prove some of that. And by corroborating these two sources, that only gives more strength to believing that, yes, okay, if two people said it, then maybe it's true. You know, if one guy just says it, maybe not. So it's like that, you know, and that's how you build historical research, build evidence, and come up with, you know, a very, hopefully, composite and well-rounded understanding of a particular period or person or whatever. So that's basically all I had to say. Thank you so much for listening for such a long time.